how much contact does Epstein Justice have with um, Virginia Giuffre, for example, and some of the other more, let's say, high-profile victims that have come forward?
Well, to be candid, we have a former victim. We have a victim that is on our board of directors, and Nick is in contact with many different victims, some of whom still continue to come forward. And so Nick Bryant, our director, is in a better position to discuss the relationship of Epstein Justice with specific victims. And I'm not in a position to discuss that relationship, other than to say that we, as an organization, are very interested in delivering justice for those victims. And, right now there's a victims fund that's been established. It's being administered by Boies Schiller, which is a law firm, if you're not familiar with it, that defended Elizabeth Holmes, among other unsavory acts. And, one of the things that victims who want to come forward have to do is sign a non-disclosure agreement in order to get paid out of that fund. That's another example, in the opinion of Nick, and I happen to share it, of a potential way that this whole situation is being covered up. The idea that you can't discuss what happened to you if you want a payout, well, that just, again, doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. And I think it's, frankly, an obvious way that victims are being silenced. The Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Attorney General for the U.S. Virgin Islands sued J.P. Morgan Chase for facilitating the sex crimes of Jeffrey Epstein. And J.P. Morgan Chase settled for $175 million. That ultimately, in a trial that didn't go to court, but also released some additional names and facts. And at the end of the day, $175 million for JP Morgan Chase is a rounding error. It's not even a blip on their balance sheet. So this is yet another example of how victims continue to be victimized, not only by the federal government, but by the financial system, which supported Epstein and made this whole thing work for him. So that's another example of why we at Epstein Justice believe that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that is absolutely necessary to get to the bottom of not just the people that were involved, but the financial institutions that were involved. You might ask yourself, why is it that J.P. Morgan Chase, who were well aware of his felony conviction for a child sex crime in Florida in 2008, continued to do business with him right up until the day he died? Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is that Jeffrey Epstein was a whale who could bring in other whales. As a practical matter, he brought many rich and famous people to bank at J.P. Morgan Chase. Now, Richard, I don't know if you've ever tried to switch your primary bank, from one bank to another, but it's incredibly inconvenient, even for a normal person, right, who doesn't have, say, a $500 million, $1 or $2, $3 billion in the bank. But if you're an incredibly high net worth individual, switching your bank is quite a chore. Yet Jeffrey Epstein somehow managed to get a number of high profile, wealthy people to switch their bank over to JP Morgan Chase. How in the world was he able to manage that? One can only imagine, going back to our earlier conversation, that he had something on them. I don't know if that's true, but I would sure like to know if it was false. And it seems to be the only reasonable explanation, given all the totality of the facts and circumstances, that would explain his persuasive powers when it came to dealing with wealthy individuals.
Do you have any friends on Capitol Hill, either in the House or in the Senate, who are on side and are pushing for an investigation or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
No. The answer to that question is no. And part of the reason why, Richard, is the following statement that has been attributed to LBJ. I don't know, it could be apocryphal, but the statement is this: if you'd like a friend on Capitol Hill, get a dog. The reality is that there are only relationships on Capitol Hill. There are no true friendships in the sense that, the real currency of Capitol Hill is money and power. And, as a practical matter, this has been well documented in Politico, among other sources. The average member of Congress works a 14-hour day. They work very hard. 8 of those hours are spent raising funds. That's what 8 of the hours of every member of Congress's day is devoted to, is raising money. So, as a practical matter, the primary qualification to be a member of Congress is your ability to raise money either from a lot of poor people or from a handful of wealthy people, or preferably some combination of both. That's your primary job in Congress, is to raise money and get reelected. And so money is the one currency that's understood on Capitol Hill. And then the other currency that's understood is power. Friendship doesn't have really much to do with it. And this is one of the reasons why it's going to take, and Nick believes this, I believe it as well, it's going to take a real public movement where tens of millions of people express their outrage and ensure that it becomes a matter of, what's the word I'm looking for? It becomes a matter of survival for members of Congress that they address this issue. Until it becomes an existential crisis for Congress, the odds are that nothing is going to happen because it's easier for things not to happen. Part of the problem, though, Richard, is that the mainstream narrative about this case is that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell acted alone. Well, we know that that's not true. And we know that they didn't certainly operate in a social circle of two. They operated in a social circle that included heads of state, that included the highest players in finance and industry, and yet somehow we're meant to believe that they were the only two people involved. Well, I really believe journalists have a role, and it can't be just Nick Bryant. He can't be the only journalist who's investigating this. Large organizations have an obligation to investigate this situation and report the facts as they see it. And that's also lacking. But if you look at it, we have a history of problems in that regard too. For example, at the run-up to the Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, when most of the mainstream publications in the United States were publishing incontrovertible evidence that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, only one newspaper, McClatchy, the McClatchy newspaper group, expressed any skepticism at all. The rest of the mainstream media in the United States absolutely supported the idea that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which was patently foolish for anybody with any sense way back then. The bottom line is that the American media goes with a certain narrative and sticks with it. That's just a tendency in any large media ecosystem. And the problem right now is there is a tension between the mainstream media narrative and what people have seen with their own eyes. And until that's resolved, you're going to have, I think, people continue to ask these questions. And what we need to do as Epstein Justice, and what we're trying to do, is get enough people involved so that Congress can't ignore this issue anymore.
You mentioned on the website, according to the CDC, 25% of underage girls, 7% of underage boys in the United States have been molested. That's more than 40 million women, 12 million men. You combine those two numbers, and that's a larger constituency than the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. How do you, I guess, harness that, that group and bring them on side?
Well, what we're going to do and what we are doing is, first of all, we'll speak to anybody who has an interest in this subject. And what we're going to urge them to do is reach out to their members of Congress. I'll tell you another thing, though, Richard. Eventually, what's going to happen as we build funds and support is we're going to be staging a series of mass demonstrations. We held one demonstration that was supported by 60 trafficking groups in December of 21. Attendance was, shall we say, not as high as anticipated. Trafficking groups are great at what they do, but what they're not really good at doing is turning out people. And so what we have to do, and what we plan to do, and what we will do, is we plan to, as we gain support, both financial and just support from people who recognize what we're trying to do here, we're going to bring those people to Washington, D.C., and to other places where it might be noticed, and get Congress's attention through demonstrations. And that's one of the things that has to happen. They have to know that people are not happy about this and that they want action from their members of Congress. One of the ways that that happens is through public protest, which still in America is a right that we enjoy. And so for those who are interested in making sure that the people who were involved in Epstein's criminal enterprise are held to account, and that we can lay the foundation so that something like this never happens again, or in fact is stopped right now. Because as you know, Richard, just from those statistics that you quoted, child sex trafficking didn't end simply because Jeffrey Epstein was died. I'm not going to say was killed or committed suicide. Just because Jeffrey Epstein is no longer walking this earth doesn't mean that child sex trafficking isn't a problem in the United States, Canada, and other countries all around the world. It's something that Congress needs to take seriously and address and deal with. And if indeed there were elements of the United States government that were involved in supporting and defending Jeffrey Epstein and his crimes, those people also have to be brought to account, or there's no way that we can prevent this from happening again. So what I would say is that how do you harness that? You harness it one person at a time who hears a message like this and says, hey, I'm going to show up when the call for a demonstration comes. I'm going to give my $2 or $3 in order to help fund that and make it happen. I'm going to take part in any way that I can to make sure that these injustices are addressed and dealt with. And you're right. This is a larger constituency. The victims themselves are a larger constituency than either of the parties in this country. And this is why Epstein Justice is nonpartisan. We don't care if you're a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, a Green Party, or have no party at all. That's not the issue for us. We just need you to tell your member of Congress that you expect them to look into this matter in a serious and substantive